You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Christopher Media, let's make some noise.
Hold your ears, folks. It's showtime.
People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off.
My mother used to say to me, "Where are you running?" "I don't know," I say, "but I'm running." I don't know why. I'm still like that now. I was in a very musical family with 5 kids, and it was right after watching the Beatles, as neighborhood girls got on the phone, what about an all-girl band?
We were the earliest female group that rocked hard, didn't play like girls, like Tinky Tinky, imagine the influence of Detroit.
My brother had set up Mickey Mouse coming in. An offer was made that he wanted just her. Wow. It devastated them, and it devastated me. I didn't know anybody, didn't go anywhere. It was really, really lonely. Then I would say Suzi Quatro came out of the ashes.
He was the first and broke the ice and kicked the door for us gals.
I've never seen a woman with an instrument in a band.
At that time, rock was a male-orientated business.
She has transcended her gender. She is now just considered an icon.
A lot of girls that tried to be Suzi Quatro, but when it's in the DNA, you can't fake that.
Certainly her position in being like the first woman leading a band, having hits like that.
This woman has so much energy, so much talent. She could have done anything.
She started expanding her career. In fact, that was hard on the marriage.
Strange how people don't like you to step out of a box, do they? And I refused to be boxed. And there's a whole chunk of growing up that got missed out. That's the person I'm trying to address now, that little girl. Yeah, I wouldn't tell her not to go. Just stop running so fast.
She did far more than show that women could play music. She showed us that we could be who we were. Because with Suzi, there was never a question.
Suzi had a dream in Detroit, and all these years later, she is still living that dream. That is amazing.
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Mr. Leon Chase.
But my friends call me the Daytona Demon.
Also back in the booth is Mr. Maurice Bursztynski.
What's shaking, pal?
On this special episode, we are looking at the 2019 film Suzi Q. It's a documentary about Detroit's own Suzi Quatro, who left the States early in her career and became more of a rock star in the UK and Australia, while not charting as high as she should have in her home country. She became known more in the U.S. thanks to her many appearances on Happy Days as the character of Leather Tuscadero. The film looks at her career overall, showing what a wild ride it has been. I'm not sure if it's possible to spoil this film, but we won't be shying away from anything that happens in it, so you have been warned. So, Leanne, what are your memories of Suzi Quatro, and what did you think of Suzi Q?
Well, like most American kids who grew up in the 70s, I knew Suzi Quatro first as Leather Tuscadero on Happy Days, which I'm sure we'll get into more. It really wasn't until I was in my 20s and going back and discovering a lot of 70s glam rock that I realized she'd had this prolific music career. And I loved everything about her. As for the movie, there's that old saying in show business that if you love sausage, don't ever see it being made, which is kind of my opinion on watching documentaries on musicians I like in general. But that said, I'm really glad that this movie exists because Suzi Quatro is a performer who deserves more recognition, especially here in the States. As a documentary, I wish the movie'd pushed a little deeper into her personality and some of her issues, but I suspect that had less to do with the filmmakers and more to do with her guarding her own image, which is pretty common among established celebrities, especially rock stars.
So, Maurice, how about you? What'd you think?
The biggest takeaway for me from the film was that she wasn't like hugely popular in the States because, as you've already gone and stated and as the film showed you, she was hugely popular here in Australia. I mean, I remember, I think as a 10-year-old, one of my classmates went and brought round his copy of the debut album, which was just called Suzi Quatro outside of Australia, but was called Can to Can here. She was everywhere. You know, you watch the TV pop music shows and the newspapers, and she was the second coming of the second coming. So I just sort of presumed that she was that way over the rest of the world. And it took till this film for me to realize that she was not really much of an entity in the States. As for my own feelings about her music, I always had a copy of Can to Can, but strangely only till about a week or so before you asked me to do this episode, I'd actually sort of gone out and bought the second and third album, Quatro and Your Mama Won't Like Me, and really, really loved those. I think as far as the movie goes, I did really enjoy this. I mean, look, it does have a lot of the tropes of a lot of these music documentaries, you know, where you get a lot of talking heads and speak to members of the family and get to speak to admiring fans. But I think what this film does right is it never sort of judges one situation over another. There's not sad music. There's not music that leads you to feeling sad, for instance, when there's obvious conflict between the sisters or the like. I just think it's not overly melodramatic when it gets to the bits about the sisters. Like Leon, I would have loved to have seen more, but I think that for the type of film that it is, I think it does a really, really excellent job.
So I felt like I lived in some sort of a weird bubble when it came to music. I just didn't really listen to a whole lot of rock or what was on the radio, maybe like oldie stations, those kind of things. So didn't really get into a lot of good music until later on in my life. And when I first saw a Suzi Quatro album at Wax Trax in Ann Arbor, it never dawned on me that Leather Tuscadero was anything other than a character on Happy Days. I never realized that Suzi Quatro was a thing. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, well, she must have cut this record after she was on Happy Days, because we all know about celebrities that will, you know, use their stardom to become stars or try to become stars. Don Johnson as an example. And so I was just like, oh, okay. Yeah. You know, because I think even Henry Winkler had like a Fonzie album, you know, so.
As did Scott Baio and Donnie Most.
God, yeah, you're right. And, you know, I mean, he didn't even have the chops of Anson Williams, who could take any song and completely suck the soul out of it. So
1, 2, 3. Splish, splash, I was taking a bath. Long about a Saturday night. A rubber dub, just relaxing in the tub, thinking everything was alright. Well, I stepped out the tub, put my feet on the floor. I wrapped the towel around me and I opened the door. And then I splish splash, I jumped back in the bath. Well, how was I to know there was a party going on? There was a splishing and a splashing, reeling with the feeling, rolling and a strolling, moving and a grooving. Hey, yeah!
So I was just like, okay, yeah, I guess Leather Tuscadero had an album. And it just took me so long to realize that she was a musician before she was on Happy Days. And I made the mistake while preparing for this episode to go back and watch a lot of Happy Days from that 5th and 6th season. And I can't remember if what season we had Fonzie jumping the shark, but I feel like I was in post-shark territory.
Yeah, that was definitely the era of Happy Days, where even as a kid, I was very conscious that they'd kind of given up on the concept of it being in the 50s. And we're just kind of, you know, like that's one of the funniest things about watching her on those episodes is, I mean, she looks awesome. I'm not complaining, but she doesn't look like she existed in the time that show was supposed to be set.
No, not at all. Her backup singers did, but not her. It was funny, like she does this gig at Arnold's and there's a talent scout at fucking Arnold's that wants to put Leather and the Suedes on tour with Fabian, and then this whole conflict with Joni replacing one of the Suedes, and she wanted to go with her on tour, and so they have to have Howard and Marion come and watch her, and oh man, yeah, it was rough. And it was weird, just, yeah, because she was doing like songs that were appropriate to the era, but then she would do Devil Gate Drive. Okay, well, and some of her songs did have like a little bit of a throwback quality, but it was just like, this does not fit with 1950s.
If you listen to those first couple of albums, Suzi Quatro or Can to Can, it is obvious where her influences lie. I mean, she has gone and said, I think in the film, that Elvis was her hero. Her music was always like a 70s take. This was not sha-na-na. It wasn't like watching Grease, although, mind you, I guess some of the music in Grease was not really like, it wouldn't have fitted in the 50s anyway, so I don't know why I said that. But yeah, she was never a 50s tribute act, but her heart and soul was in 50s rock and roll music. You know, I'm guessing that she was probably a big fan of, say, Eddie Cochran and the like. Having her there was appropriate. I mean, there's that moment in the film where they suggest that it was originally going to be Debbie Harry that they were going to offer the role to, and that would have been neither musically nor character-wise where they wanted the character to go. My sort of thoughts about the Happy Days thing, and we're possibly sort of talking way earlier about Happy Days than we'd meant to, but as long as we're on it, her image to that point had been as, you know, this tough, take no prisoners sort of rock and roll performer. I mean, you look at the front cover of that debut album and it's almost frightening. You know, she's there, she's wrapped in leather, and she's got these three guys who look like they're going to bash the shit out of you rather than entertain you. And then she goes into this family-friendly show that's 50s revisionist, whichever way you look at it. And, you know, she's family-friendly, and it just sort of seemed to go against the image that maybe she'd gone and cultivated on those first couple of albums. I mean, I know she says a lot about what you see is what you get. This is me. You know, later on she also says, but hey, what is also me is I'm a mother and I'm an ordinary gal. So there's lots of claims of, you know, who she was by herself. And I just sort of thought that maybe having her, she even said that she enjoyed doing the Happy Days experience, and that's terrific. But it just seemed to be like in 1975 or 76 when she did that, it just sort of seemed to really sort of clash with those albums that she'd put out before, never mind, you know, the music that she was actually performing in the show.
Both of you guys brought up the family relationships, and that's so crucial to this documentary. And for me, it was one of the most striking things. I mean, I, again, wasn't familiar with the Pleasure Seekers, the early group that the Quatro sisters had been a part of or made themselves, and then wasn't familiar with Cradle or the way that these bands came about. And all of these interviews with her sisters are just so interesting to watch, and just really sets up just such a fascinating portrait. To hear the one sister, and I can kind of understand where she's coming from, but the one sister who's just like, I will never be a fan of Suzi Quatro. And it's like, okay, I guess I can figure where you're saying that you can't be a fan of your sister, that she's your sister and you'll never be a fan of her. But it just, the way that she says it makes it feel like I am not a fan of Suzi Quatro, and basically, like, I'm not a fan of my sister. I'm not a big admirer of my sister is how it comes off, though I guess I might be reading too much into it.
I don't think so, Mike. I think, the elephant in the room in this movie in a lot of ways is the fact that she had a really good band with her sisters, in my opinion. I knew the Pleasure Seekers just from sort of seeking out 60s Detroit, all that kind of interesting garage rock that never really got big out of Detroit. And, I think that band was great. I think that the movie does a good job of showing that she did have this viable, potentially successful thing with her sisters. And the fact is, she got an offer to go solo and leave them behind, and she took it. And I think That's probably where the sister's animosity towards her comes from. And I also think that it's a little weird that she seems later on in the movie to lament not having a good relationship with her family, but you've already kind of explained why that happened.
I didn't actually take away from the interviews in the film with the sisters that obviously there was animosity at some stage, but like when I think it was Nancy who says, "I'm not a fan of my sister," she says, "I love my sister, but I'm not a fan." I really did take it to mean like I'm not so distant where I just sort of see her completely. I just see Suzi Quatro, the image. I see her. She is my sister. That's why I am not a fan, rather than I can't stand the sight of her. But of course, there is that moment in the film, though, which really, I guess, was pretty shocking, where she plays that cassette, and she's kept that cassette with her all her life. And for those who haven't seen it yet, there was a moment where she, I think it was in 1974, the family, knowing that she's in London, send her a tape that they've made around the Thanksgiving table, and she receives it at Christmas. And it has them saying things like, "Well, what do you think of Suzi's success?" "Oh, yeah, look, I'm surprised because she's not really that talented. She's a sloppy bass player." And Suzi says, "That really, really cut me deep." And according to what you're saying there, Leon, it's understandable. They're talking from a place of hurt. And Suzi, I don't know whether at the time she thought, well, I can sort of understand this, or whether she was genuinely thinking, I don't get what the problem is. I've gone off to do my own thing. Can't they be happy for me? I would have liked that dynamic maybe to have been a little bit more explored. But on the other hand, I am grateful that the film doesn't completely turn into a big melodrama, a big soap opera. So
Yeah, because you got a lot of plates are spinning in this movie, because there's the family stuff, there's her career, having your own husband as part of the band, so having that family part of it, her as an alien in the UK, and then the whole idea of why is she successful every place but her own country is a major theme in this too.
You know, you sit any family down and you start asking them about old issues, and you're going to get an earful. So, you know, we do have to keep it in that context. I don't think that when the sister makes the comment about her, not being a fan, I think that is about not really buying into the image, but I think is very common if you do know someone, you know, personally who's had some public success.
You're an example. I mean, you are a successful filmmaker. Your wife is a successful actress. I don't know if you would say I'm a fan of my wife, or if it's just she's my wife, so I can't necessarily be a fan, you know, like have that admiration relationship that you have with someone who's in a public space, you know, because you get to see what that person is like when they're not on stage.
It would have been interesting to have known if they would have asked the question, are you proud of your sister? What the response to that would have been, because that's the litmus test. You know, if they're not proud, then maybe there's still some lingering resentment. You know, pride and being a fan are two different things.
I'm also fascinated by the kind of person who keeps a tape like that.
I was wondering myself, I'm like, this isn't just something that they kind of recreated for this. This really sounds and feels like it's the real thing, you know, because there are other times in the documentary, obviously they're not shooting planes coming into Australia and they're just taking a filter and shooting something now, or using stock footage and then making it look like it was 1972 or whenever she does her first tour of Australia. So it's like, okay, well, that, you know, there's fakery that we buy in documentaries where we're just like, okay, this is not pure. This has not been taken from archival footage. You know, this is just something that we're doing to represent something. But then, yeah, you sit down and you have that tape playing and the quotes coming up of what they're saying around the Thanksgiving table. And it's just like, wow, she kept that tape. Man, that's really something to take you down a notch every time you listen to it. That's got to be so hurtful.
I just wanted to sort of like take the conversation a bit away from the family for a moment, but because you mentioned there, Mike, about what's archival and what's been set up, I think you can have something that's both. So there's this moment in the film which I'm wondering, what is this from? There's the moment fairly early on after she's first gone to London and Mickey Most is trying to work out, what do I do with her? And you see them in a hotel room, and she's sitting, I think, behind a piano or something. Or no, she's holding a bass. And he's trying to work out with her, I'm not sure how we can go with the arrangement of this song. You have to think about what you want to do with it, and I'll come and see you tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit more about it. And we know it's definitely from that era because her hair's still frizzy. This is, before she became big. So, I mean, I know that later on in the 80s, electronic press kits were a big thing. She hadn't even released a record yet. Why were they doing an electronic press kit? I mean, did such a thing even exist? I'm sort of trying to work, why was this being filmed? And given that there are a couple of shots that are edited together, it's not even like someone has a Super 8 camera and they're just recording this for its own posterity. It's edited. So I'd really be curious to know what that footage is. Was it staged? Was it natural? And if it was natural, what was it being recorded for? It just seemed very peculiar.
It seems so staged to me, especially when he walks out the door and then we just kind of like, I think there's a slow push or just like a little bit of a zoom in on her. And it's just like, okay. But yeah, you're right. It's like, was this a news segment or were they going to shoot a documentary at this time or what? Yeah, it just seemed really out of left field.
Yeah, my guess based on the footage was that was probably a documentary with a budget or some kind of TV special maybe, but it's also like, if they're staging it, there's some pretty raw moments to be staging as well. Like the whole thing is a little boggling.
One thing that they do address throughout the entire thing is the whole idea of a woman in the 70s and being a rocker. And it was one of those like, it just wasn't done. It wasn't nearly as common as it might be today. I look at the charts and I mean, you can't call Taylor Swift a rocker or whatever, but I mean, somebody like a Taylor Swift, if you go back far enough, it's like, okay, thanks to Suzi Quatro being this very strong person, strong personality, like we can have women who own their own career, their own image and are able to do this kind of stuff. So I'm so glad that they have these voices of women who I really admire. I mean, I was a huge L7 fan when I first heard them. KT Tungstall, Debbie Harry, so many great interviews with female rock stars that say that they owe a lot to Suzi Quatro and what she was able to do. There's one moment in the movie that just floors me, which is this whole thing where she's on a talk show and they have her turn around and then smack her ass. I had no idea that there was a contest called the Rear of the Year in Britain, but apparently it has something to do with that. And wow, just when they turn her around and smack her ass on TV, I was like, how far have we come? I am so glad that this doesn't happen anymore, or at least doesn't happen on TV too often.
Why is it sexist?
The objectification of men, it doesn't diminish their economic or professional power, but when you objectify women, you get the pay gap, you get discrimination in the workplace. So I think
actually women who self-objectify their bodies in entertainment tend to make more money than the women who don't. So that argument doesn't wash.
I don't think so, and I don't think a lot of women are putting...
Linda Evangelista didn't get out of bed for less than 10 grand.
I'm glad that you sent out that link to that article, Mike, because it adds a little bit of context to what we see in the film. It doesn't excuse Russell Harty's behavior, but that whole Rear of the Year thing, that is very much of a time. I thought that was 70s, but it turns out like that was 1982. Now, last month, I think it was, Mike, when you joined us for See Here, we were speaking about The Kids Are All Right, and we saw Russell Harty on that program as well. And it sort of seemed like, Daltrey and Entwistle really didn't want to have much to do with him. And he was trying to get information out of them that they didn't want to give. I wonder what else Russell Harty has done. And then seeing this moment in the film where he just smacks her ass, I'm thinking, oh my Lord, what is going on here? And I read an interview outside of the link that you said, where Suzi said, if he tried that shit backstage, I would have punched him in the jaw. And I'm just sort of wondering whether punching him in the jaw on set, on the TV set, because she said I was too professional to do that. I'm wondering whether punching him in the jaw on TV would have actually been a bad career move at all. I think she could have gotten away with it. I imagine there would have been some people who would have seen that as unacceptable. I also wanted to look up some other things with Russell Harty, see, like, what was his reputation like as an interviewer? And I saw an interview that he did, if you want to call it that, with Grace Jones. And okay, fair enough. Grace Jones does have the reputation for being maybe a little bit difficult in interviews, but, really he treated her patronizingly. And so she gave it back to him. And it was a terrible interview. So I thought, well, maybe he's just generally crap with, pop stars or maybe with interviews in general, because then I saw Grace Jones with Joan Rivers. And also I saw her with, Don Lane, who was like an American Tonight Show interviewer who worked in Australia. And she was perfectly fine with both of them, funny and vivacious and humorous, and told great stories, but just with Russell Harty. So I don't know if there's anyone English who's listening to this podcast, please write in and tell us, was Russell Harty an asshole in general?
Either way, I think that's such an important moment in this film because, lest we sit here in 2020 and get too critical in hindsight, we have to remember that, as Mike hinted at, she was such a pioneer. The idea of a female rock star, and not only a female rock star, but to be this woman who is dressing in what's basically bondage gear and is acting tough and, I sincerely believe was capable of punching that man in the jaw. She probably would have been labeled as difficult and, banned from show business back then. She was really navigating uncharted waters. And that, I watched that moment and, it's interesting that you read up on him because I didn't know much about him. But either way, I watched that and I thought, like, this guy's an ally. These are the people promoting her. Like, imagine what it was like behind the scenes, or the people who hated her just for existing. It's like mad respect, Suzi.
Oh, when she talks about going from radio station to radio station during the American days, and that's how you got your records play. And her husband at the time was saying, to get your records played, you'd bring the DJs a whole suitcase full of cocaine. That's the only way they would maybe play your record. I don't think there's any, possibly apart from our NPR DJs, I don't think there's any DJ in Detroit right now that I respect at all. They all just come across as big old yahoos, and like there's, to think about the shit that she probably put up with these guys who think that they have a little bit of power because they're like on a fucking, backwater radio station in Boise, Idaho or something. What would that have been like? That must have been horrible.
I can't remember what the expression was, but I know that we've heard stories about graft and corruption being a big thing in American radio. Payola, thank you, since the early days of rock and roll. So I guess that was par for the course. It was just an accepted thing. I'd love to know where there was a point. I mean, if there's been a point where that payola actually stopped in this day and age where more and more people are listening to their music through other means, whether even getting your new music on the radio is even a thing anymore. I'm talking aside from what we call here the public access stations or your college radio stations, which seem to be the only things that might play something new. Everything else is just tried and true.
Well, I've spent a little bit of time with some guys who sort of came right before me in the film, TV, entertainment, whatever industry. I worked behind the scenes for a long time, and you hear stories about the suitcases of cocaine and such. And the reigning wisdom seems to be that payola, for the most part, went to MTV. And then as the corporations figured out how to really micromanage every step of the formula, the idea of a person sort of organically growing as a performer and coming to you and getting discovered pretty much got thrown out the window. It still happens, especially with people like rappers and stuff. But, the story I always got is that, the DJ as the all powerful, tastemaker has been long gone for several decades.
I can't even imagine most of the DJs these days even choose their own records. I'm sure there's nobody that goes in now other than apart from the folks that you mentioned, Morris, that go in and like grab the stack of records and start flipping through. And they're like, okay, I'm going to play these on my show. It's got to be all just pre-programmed with their little breaks and, okay, off I go. I'm going to talk for 20 minutes about whatever comes through on the teletype, the AP or whatever. Cause that's the thing too, is there are so many times where I'll sit down in the morning or even before I go to bed at night, and I'll read some news stories, and then sure thing, the next morning, if you turn on the radio, you're going to hear the same 5 headlines across every single news organization, or every single DJ is going to be like, oh, did you hear about this wacky guy down in Florida who did this? And it's like, oh my God, it just sounds like, I love when they do those things on, say, like, The Daily Show, or on John Oliver's show last week tonight, where he'll just cut together all of the news clips that are the exact same story. You could do the exact same thing if you took a day of radio DJs and just listened to every single morning drive time show. You would hear the exact same stories in the exact same language. And then they would go, and now call us and tell us your great stories. And it's like, oh, great. Thanks.
It raises an interesting point about Suzi Quatro, which is if you look at her, not only did she have this image that, everyone is obviously influenced by someone else, but it really was, as far as I can tell, like a very original look. She may have seen Girl on a Motorcycle a few times, but, there really is a sense of this, I remember even the first time I sort of saw one of her albums going, wow, like, where did this come from? And then to be a bass player, I got to say, the idea of the lead singer playing bass and then being a woman doing it again, I don't think that was a formula. That was really all her own invention.
I had dual feelings about this. I mean, yes, she was hugely important. And obviously from the film, there's moments where they show the other musicians further on down the line who gave her the respect that she deserved and she obviously craved. The film does sort of make a token point, I think, early on by saying that, there were musicians like Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Christine McVie who had come before her. And the film does say we're not going to make the point that she was the first female musician to be strong, but I would have liked to have seen a little bit more kudos given to, even people like, Wanda Jackson, 50s rock and roller, and Aretha Franklin and Nina Simone, 2 really, really strong female singers and musicians. They paved a hell of a lot of ground. And even though Carol Kay was not a singer in the public eye, but she was a strong female bass player who really had to hold her own amongst many male musicians, and she got their respect because she did the job. And I'd be surprised if Suzi wasn't a fan of any of those people. And yes, she came up with something that was fresh, but I'd have liked to have seen a little bit more talked about those who came before and paved the way for her as much as she paved the way in a rock and roll sense for the musicians that you've already gone and mentioned, Mike.
Oh, I agree. I think I was referring more to her image, the idea of this woman in the leather suit playing the bass. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. I would have loved to have seen a little bit more. Tina Turner is a great missing link in that list as well.
The era that we grew up in, seeing a woman playing a bass in a band was, at least, as a fan of alternative music, was not, that was like de rigueur. I'm thinking like Sonic Youth and Smashing Pumpkins and the Breeders / the Pixies. And it's just like, okay, yeah, that's the thing, to the point where it was almost a stereotype. Well, okay, yeah, you put the girl in the bass. I don't know why that was. What I think maybe even White Zombie might have had a female bass player as well. And it was just like, okay, yeah, that's cool. Her and that freaking huge bass. I kept trying to picture her setting that thing down. It probably would have come up to at least her neck. It just looked almost as tall as she is. And just, yeah, she could play the shit out of that bass. And I was so glad when they finally figured out, okay, we're going to feature the bass in these songs and make this her instrument, because otherwise they were, like they do with a lot of music mixes, they were just burying the bass. It was just, they were carrying the load of the percussion and it wasn't doing that much on its own, but she could really make that thing sing.
I have a theory that plays a little bit into why she was a bigger hit in the UK and I believe Australia, because there was this real bassy, bottom heavy brand of glam rock. I'm thinking of like Slade or The Sweet, bands like that were known in the US, but they were never big here the way that, say, a Led Zeppelin or the Stones or, a lot of these other big rock acts were. And I think that her sound, again, kind of back to the continuum and the influences, like she was very much either influenced or otherwise like playing to that genre, which featured like a really heavy bass, really that great sort of like deep tom sound. I'm getting into audio engineer stuff here a little bit, but like it's just, I'm a huge fan of that. And I guess that kind of leads us to the question about her not having huge success here.
My perception about why she hit it really big in Australia has less to do with the glam rock era. And I know that she's actually said she never saw herself as a glam rock artist. And I probably, on the whole, tend to agree with her on that. But in Australia, from like the late 60s into the early 70s, the big thing, if you were to go see a band in the clubs, or, listen to the radio, was heavy blues-based music. I mean, our version of Woodstock was the Sunbury Music Festival. Sunbury's like a little town just maybe a few kilometres outside of Melbourne. And the Sunbury festivals in the early 70s, I think for 3-4 years, were absolutely huge. And there were bands that played no bullshit, no nonsense, heavy blues-based boogie music. So you're thinking of bands like Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs and Buster Brown, Lobby Lloyd, Chain and Carson and the Kevin Borich Express. And then later on in the 70s, bands that were absolutely huge, bands like Cold Chisel and the Angels and Jojo Zapp and the Falcons, who I know you're familiar with, Mike, through the 20th Century Oz soundtrack. All those bands were part of the Australian top 40 and general part of the musical landscape. So here comes Suzi Quatro, who's playing her brand of rock and roll, and it fits in completely with the music that we were listening to from our own backyard. So it makes complete sense why she was popular here. I can't say for certain why she wasn't popular in the States, unless except for your theory, Leon, that they associated her more with the glam rock era, and glam didn't seem to be a big thing in the States. But yeah, so, I mean, some of the glam bands were very big here, like Sweet. Sweet was huge over here. I tend to sort of think of her more in the blues boogie sort of bag, if you want to call it that. But what I like, and especially coming back to the albums that I've been listening to over the last few weeks, plus what we hear in the film, is that she didn't want to stick with the one thing. So like the first couple of albums, that's the image that we have of her, the blues and boogie sort of thing. But by the time we get to the third album, Your Mama Won't Like Me, which I've had like a month to live with now, she was obviously digging into funk music. I mean, there was still something of, what she was doing before, but like her drummer and her own bass playing, they're really sort of grooving on maybe on her Motown roots. I mean, I guess it's a little bit more dirty than the Motown sound, but that album has some glorious funk in it. And then, as we see later on, like the next couple of albums down the line, she's sort of going for more a poppy, gentle acoustic sound. And then later on in the film, I guess we'll talk more about it then, is she explored musical theatre. And one of the things that she says in the film, I'm not having anyone put me in a bag. My husband thinks that I'm just going to be this type of musician, but I want to explore a whole bunch of other things. And it really, as early as 75 or 76, when Your Mama Don't Like Me came out, that was already evidence that she was wanting to try something different. And obviously she says, I don't want to do the Leather Tuscadero thing anymore, because they're going to get the impression that that's all I can do. And I think that's as much associated with those first two albums, a much gentler, family-friendly version of that, but still associated with that tough leather image. She was ready to do something else, and so huge respect to her for doing that.
Yeah, I found that really admirable. And, getting back a little bit as from the American perspective and someone who is a big fan of 70s rock, I like to say, again, I can't speak for Australia, but if you look at the UK, like in the early 70s, I like to say that the UK went glitter and America was going denim. And if you look at the mainstream, like who was a real superstar in America in the 70s, it ended up being like the Eagles and this real kind of middle of the road, vaguely countryish, but without any sort of edge. I really think that she had an image that was, it's an overused phrase, but really ahead of its time. in terms of what people were receptive to, or at least what we were being sold.
For shits and giggles, I just put in, top songs of 1975. Now, granted, I like a lot of these songs, but when you look at the choice of what was out there in the top 40, what actually broke through, Rhinestone Cowboy, Shining Star by Earth, Wind and Fire, fucking fantastic song. I'm Not in Love by 10cc. Tony Orlando and Dawn, B.J. Thomas, Major Harris, Casey and the Sunshine Band. So it's like we're doing like Gordon Lightfoot. We're doing like singer-songwriters. We've got, Feel Like Making Love by Bad Company. That's not that heavy, but it's heavier than other things. And then you've got like, you were saying like funk, like That's the Way of the World by Earth, Wind and Fire. And we've got disco with Casey and the Sunshine Band, Jive Talkin' by the Bee Gees. But that's also the fucking era of, and, I said I wasn't going to put anything down, but that's the era of Feelings by Morris Albert. I mean, one of the worst songs ever. So it must have been so difficult because, this just wasn't as hard as you could get. Punk rock was still around the corner. Hard rock really wasn't at that great of a point right now. Prog rock was kind of a thing over here, funk and disco. So it was, it would have been tough for somebody to break through with what she had.
What you're talking about really plays into a much larger continuum in American music and really how Americans treat, quote, pop music versus the rest of the world, where it's always been a little throwaway. It's always been like, yeah, that was cool, but here's the new thing you should buy. Incredibly American attitude. And if you look, America culturally has been absolutely amazing at inventing musical genres and then throwing them away until some other country picks it up and does something awesome with it and sells it back to us. And I mean, that's going back really, to the Beatles at least, and she's just, it makes complete sense to me that she would get much more recognition abroad because this country has just always been about, well, what can I sell you? And particularly in the 70s, I think once again, we were making all this great, really interesting rock in the 60s. And then as the industry became more and more an industry, in the States, at least, it was really becoming about like, well, what kind of feel good thing can we sell that everybody's going to enjoy? Again, back to the Happy Days thing, really.
Yeah, you started Happy Days, you ended Happy Days. It all comes back in a big circle.
Wasn't that the period where Kiss was just starting to make it big? I mean, Kiss Alive, was that 1975 or 76? And they were pretty big, like about, the time. Well, I mean, okay, I guess, Suzi Q was coming in earlier than before they broke big, but Kiss showed that a loud rock band could still sort of break through the singer-songwriter or the middle-of-the-road things that maybe Barry Manilow or Barbra Streisand were putting down.
Kiss came up earlier because I was trying to think of, well, who was doing some version of what might be considered glam in America, and Kiss was really the ones that sort of picked that mantle up, though. Born and raised in the southern suburbs of Detroit, I'm a Kiss fan, but but in terms of the actual, in terms of heaviness, if we're really rating those songs, they were still, the way that Kiss was recorded was not, on par with what AC/DC was doing, or what The Sweet was doing just in terms of sort of sonic impact, but yeah, I think you're correct. They were one of the only ones, Alice Cooper, who Alice Cooper would tell you that Kiss ripped him off completely. But, in terms of taking that thing and kind of making a heavy performance oriented thing, it was happening. I'm speaking more in terms of when I talk about the industry with a capital I and what was being sold. I think Mike's correct that there was this constant quest in the 70s to get as middle of the road as possible, I guess, because you could sell more records that way. And punk, I think, at least in the States, was a huge reaction to that.
Well, and don't forget, too, that the only top 10 or number one hit that Kiss had was fucking Beth, So it's like their songs were selling and they had massive fans. I think they called themselves the Kiss Army. But yeah, it's like fucking Disco Duck is, number one song in the country at the time. So it's just that's the thing. It's so frustrating when you're watching Suzi Q, the documentary, and you're seeing this song, number one in the UK, number one in Sweden, number one in Portugal, didn't chart in the US. And it's it was tough to break through because we had Don't Pull Your Love Out on Me Baby or the Rubber Band Man or these kind of things were the ones in the, the top 40 hits of the year. So yeah, stuff like the things that we're talking about, the Sweet, fucking New York Dolls, Kiss, any of these things, they're not going to break through. They're not going to cut through the noise of top 40 radio.
There would have probably been a lot of regional hits. I mean, yeah, sure, there was not going to be as many rock and roll bands that were going to sweep the whole country. But, I mean, like, one of my beloved collections of music is the Nuggets box set that Lenny Kaye assembled. They're all regional hits. I mean, there might have been like a couple that sort of broke out of just one state, but it seems like though these were more, here are the songs that people forgot. But it seems like there were always pockets of people who, as long as they could put on a guitar or get behind a drum kit, and play the bass, would still sort of love what the possibilities that rock and roll music could do. And, but yeah, look, I guess it is a shame that, America as a whole, as you put it like that, won't buy into that.
There's another piece to that puzzle, which we've touched on a little bit, because if I think about 70s rock, yes, rock was huge in America. And a lot of that was bands like the Stones and Led Zeppelin, but there was an enormous amount of really great, what they call classic rock now coming out in that era. And when I think about like a classic, who was making really great, innovative, heavy rock and roll in the 70s, I think of Van Halen. And then what I also think of is how incredibly entrenched all that was in a very male, macho, boys club kind of thing, which, don't get me wrong, as a little kid, as a little boy, I absolutely loved it. But I can also see that there is a sexism that has not gone away, that was a million times worse back then. And I think there really was a really negative response in America to the idea of any woman who's not a soul singer or, a Leslie Gore type or a nice, sweet Carole King type. I think that there was really a lot of resentment almost toward any woman who dared to get up and claim to be a rocker, as we've seen with, lest we forget, the Runaways as well.
She's talking about at one point how they come back from a tour as the Pleasure Seekers, and it's like, okay, we come back to Detroit, and now we've got, the MC5, and, you think of other artists from that time, and you can sit there and go, okay, MC5, Iggy and the Stooges, Bob Seger, Ted Nugent, and it's just, boys after boys after boys after boys.
Given that, punk is not necessarily my specialty, but it does seem to me that the role of punk music did level the playing field somewhat, but maybe that's once again not from an American perspective. But yeah, certainly I think in England, where, mind you, another American expat who had to take on a band of British musicians, I'm thinking Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders, in the States, Patti Smith, Suzi Q. I'm imagining that punk in general sort of thought, fuck that patriarchy. We're just going to strap on the guitars and we're going to make beautiful noise. But yeah, in terms of the classic rock, maybe there was far less of that.
How many classic rock songs are about girls just turning 17?
The opening song to the first album by my favorite band ever, unfortunately.
I never would have associated her with glitter because I don't know. I just, I guess the leather and stuff. And I have nothing against glitter rock. There were so many great glitter rockers, but I never would have put her in that box. But then, like she says, she doesn't want to be in a box. That is an interesting thing about the Runaways. I had never associated, so I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but I had never associated her image with the Runaways as strongly as they make the case for in the movie. And just that, I never have, I guess because growing up with Joan Jett being a solo artist, Joan Jett, like I wasn't even that familiar with the Runaways. And so when they were talking about how Joan Jett would get approached by people who insisted that she was Suzi Quatro or that Suzi Quatro had done the things that Joan Jett did, it boggled my mind. I really just never would have confused those two.
I find it interesting how they mention in the film that Joan Jett wanted to be a clone of, I guess like you, Mike, if I would have sat down and thought about it, I thought, oh yeah, I guess she probably would have been a fan, but the level of idol worship just, wow. Yeah. I never would have guessed that. And actually just sort of coming back to the Happy Days thing, that's where Suzi, I guess it's not where she ended her acting career, but it's sort of where it stopped at that time. She didn't sort of decide to make a lot more of a thing about it. And there's that movie in the 80s that Paul Schrader wrote and directed called Light of Day, which features Joan Jett. And I was sort of thinking while doing prep for this, I reckon I would have liked to have seen Suzi Quatro in the part that Joan Jett did, playing alongside Michael Fox. Is that a film that you gents have seen?
Oh, yes.
I have not seen it.
This is a little bit of a side note, but fun fact, that film was shot in Cleveland, and there's a scene where there's a new wave band opening for them, fronted by Trent Reznor.
That's true, yes. Yes, it is.
There's a documentary about Joan Jett, and I don't remember the whole Suzi Quatro thing coming up in there. There's also a documentary about the Runaways called Edge Play that I still haven't watched yet, and I'd be very curious to, because so this is kind of very much an aside, but a few years ago, one of the former members of the Runaways was on Jeopardy and becoming this kind of a mini Jeopardy champ. You know, she was no James Holzhauer, but she was really good. And I was just like, wow. And then they started talking about how she was in a rock band. And I went back and I looked up her and what she had done and stuff, and just uncovering all of the garbage that she had put up with, and to the point where saying the manager of the Runaways was had raped her, and just all this shit that she had gone through, and then who backed her up on this stuff. And it was like, I don't think that Joan Jett backed her up on it. And so it was just like, ooh, I wonder if this Edge Play will get into those things, because it sounds like a fascinating story, but also a really horrific story.
We actually covered Edge Play on See Here a few years back. And, yeah, it is pretty interesting. I would have liked to have seen maybe a little bit more, but maybe that's because I don't necessarily know that much about the Runaways. So maybe there were some things I wanted to know more, but yeah, certainly it did reveal that there was a lot of sordid stuff going on, and they had to put up with a hell of a lot of shit. So
yeah, once again, if you like sausage.
Yeah, exactly.
Kim Fowley in particular is by all accounts a foul human being. So, yeah, if you get into the Runaways story in any depth, you're going to start hearing some nasty things about him.
Yep, that's exactly who I was talking about. I couldn't remember the gentleman's name, though he doesn't sound like a gentleman.
You know, there's another thing that occurs to me, which is I don't doubt that Joan Jett was a huge fan of Suzi Quatro. Why wouldn't she be? And also just as a sort of, you know, someone who came right before and someone to sort of emulate or at least be inspired by. I also think it's funny that, again, back to the kind of inherent sexism in that era, that there is this sense that people have, like, that there can be only one. That if I, you know, that, oh, here's this female rocker, that must be Joan Jett. Whereas, like, how many guys in the 80s look like Rob Halford, at least in terms of what they were wearing? You know, how many guitar players emulated Eddie Van Halen? Like, there were a million of these, you know, whether they were inspired or ripoffs. We were fine with, you know, 20 bands in the 80s that look like Motley Crue. But as soon as there's like two tough women fronting bands, it's like, well, how can that be?
I'm sure that some of our former soul singers have been mistaken for other soul singers in the past, where it's just like, oh yeah, you're the guy from you're a Pip, right? No, I'm one of the Four Tops. Oh yeah, I love your song, Papa Was a Rolling Stone.
Listen, that gets into Black Lives in general, which is a whole other podcast, to say the least.
Oh, and it was Jackie Fuchs who I was thinking of, who went by Jackie Fox when she was in the Runaways, and I do see that she is in Edge Play, so that's more reason for me to see it. Morris, I know that you had put out a question on a group recently asking about performers who have done musical theater, and I did find it fascinating. I would have loved to have seen Suzi Quatro as Annie Oakley in Annie Get Your Gun. It just looked like an amazing performance.
I'm wondering whether there's somewhere on YouTube or on DVD somewhere like a full performance of that, because we get a little bit of footage there, but that might have been just for a news story. And here's Suzi Quatro. Remember the leather? Well, she's now putting on a dress. I did put out a question in the Steve Hoffman Music Forum to see what people would come up with. And, I mean, look, besides Suzi Quatro, the only two people I could remember were both associated with the Pirates of Penzance. So Linda Ronstadt famously did a season or however long, I don't know where, if it was on Broadway, for Pirates of Penzance. And here locally, a singer in the 70s who was beloved here, I don't think really known much outside of Australia, maybe in Europe, was a guy called John English. And I mean, he'd started out in Jesus Christ Superstar, but once he'd sort of gotten through that, he was like this big rock star in Australia of the 70s. And then he just decided to go into musical theatre, and he was a good actor, so he absolutely owned the Pirates of Penzance. People weren't talking about anyone else in the cast, just John English. But the other, some of the other people who had been mentioned in the forum that I can remember were Peter Noon of Herman and the Hermits, who I'm presuming took the Pirate King role that John English did in Pirates of Penzance. Paul Stanley, having done Phantom of the Opera, and I think we discussed that, Mike, with you on Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park episode. Mickey Dolenz had a part apparently in the Tim Rice Elton John script of Aida. That was pretty amazing to read. But I think a lot of the responses that people came up with tended to be more in the Tim Rice, Andrew Lloyd Webber musical type thing, which, apart from Jesus Christ Superstar, is certainly not rock. Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, or productions of Grease, which is playing on popular music styles. I mean, it's not pop music. Well, it's not rock music, certainly. That would work in its own right, but it's not musical theatre. I was sort of like looking for more responses in terms of things that had been written for that, like Les Miserables, or people had gone and done a rock star who'd gone and done Oklahoma or South Pacific or West Side Story, that sort of thing. Yeah, I'm really surprised that people didn't come up with more responses like that. And yet, there must have been more people like Suzi Quatro who'd gone into traditional musical theatre. And really just that thing in the film where she said that she was going to write her own music, or she was going to write her own musical about Tallulah Bankhead. I loved that. She just sort of thought, well, I've already shown that I can act in something. I've shown that I can sing music that is not what you normally associate with me. And guess what? I'm going to write music. I'm going to write a play, and I'm going to write the music, and I'm going to star in it. And they went to some great pains in the film to sort of show that, Tallulah Bankhead and Annie Oakley were very much characters simpatico with Suzi Quatro. So I absolutely loved that. I love finding that out. And once again, coming back to what we were discussing early on in the film about, did the film go far enough? And, maybe another half hour would have been great, but I really do think that there are a lot of things in this film that I just came away thinking, I did not know that. And really, that was fantastic. I just loved learning that sort of stuff, that she had that connection to other forms of music, and something I wouldn't necessarily have associated her with.
Yeah, the one that popped to my mind when we were talking about this was I knew that Joan Jett had been in a cast of Rocky Horror Picture Show. I also assumed that she would have been at least Frankenfurter, but she ended up being Columbia. So I'm surprised that she didn't have a bigger part. Not that there are any small parts in that movie, but just, or production, I should say. But I know that I've seen women play Frankenfurter, so I assume that she would be that, kind of build up to her performance, build up to her coming on screen, rather than her being one of Frank's helpers.
I'm married to a professional actor, so I have a little bit of insight into this. That could very much be a business decision as well. The idea of taking risks on people who, shall we say, are accustomed to a rock star lifestyle versus an incredibly disciplined Broadway lifestyle, and what it really takes in terms of the hours and the rehearsals, and to put it in after, night after night. I know people who've done Broadway shows, and it's really, it's like being a professional athlete. It's really above and beyond. So I wouldn't be surprised if, with some of that sort of boutique casting, it might be on the production side where they're a little hesitant to take a chance on somebody like that.
It always floors me when I hear those stories of Broadway actors that are in two productions in one night, where they'll do a bit part in one and then run across the street and change and be in another production.
Cynthia Nixon, yeah, she did that.
Who I only just saw last night watching Amadeus. So I had to sort of look twice and think, is that her? Oh my God. So it is.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and take a quick break, and we're going to play a pair of interviews. First, we're going to hear from Suzi Quatro herself, and then we'll hear from some of the folks behind Suzi Q, director Liam Firmager and producer Tate Brady. And we'll be back with both of those right after these brief messages.
How to continue a television series after a major actor has left the cast. Part 2. The Blake 7 Method.
Remove the character from the script. Introduce a new replacement character. Eventually, few of the original characters will be present, and the series will barely resemble its original form.
For more about British science fiction television, listen to the British Invaders podcast. www.britishinvaders.com.
Let me ask you a question. Are you getting enough? I bet you'd love more, right? Well, AdamandEve.com wants to give you more with 10 free gifts. First, you'll get a sexy surprise for her. Second, a specially selected toy for him. And third, a little something we know you'll both enjoy. Plus, you'll get 6 full-length adult movies on DVD. And number 10, free shipping on your entire order. So what do you have to do to get your 10 free gifts? It's not hard. Just go to AdamandEve.com and select any one item. It could be an adventurous new toy, sexy piece of lingerie, or anything you desire. Just enter offer code BOOTH at checkout, and you'll get all 10 free gifts. Go check out AdamandEve.com today. Select one item and get 10 free gifts, including free shipping when you enter offer code BOOTH. That's BOOTH at AdamandEve.com.
Hi there, faithful Projection Booth listener, Chris Stashew here. If you're looking for even more deep dive film discussion, both old and new, on and off the cinematic beaten path, check out the Culture Cast. Every episode I'm joined by a different guest as we traverse the cinema landscape talking about not only our monthly theme, but also some of the year's biggest films. I'm even joined by the host of the Projection Booth, the one and only Mike White. So if you want to listen to even more conversations on film, head on over to culturecast.com or find it on all podcatchers, both Android and iOS.
I'm Chris Cooling from Forgotten TV, and you're listening to The Projection Booth, the ultimate movie podcast.
Ms. Quatro, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I've been a fan of yours for a while, especially because you come from Detroit, which is where I'm at right now. And I'm curious, where did you grow up in the city?
I was born and raised in Grosse Pointe Woods, suburb. And then we moved to Grosse Pointe Farms when I was about 14. And then we were in that. So I was only ever in 2 houses. The one on Torrey Road in Grosse Pointe Woods is like my heart. I've left my heart there. And then we moved to a place on Allard Road just by 7 Mile and Mac, around there.
What kind of role did music play when you were growing up?
My father worked for General Motors in the daytime, and in the evening he was a musician. He had 5 kids, and we were all very musical. We all played various instruments. I myself play classical piano and percussion. I read, write, and play both instruments. And when I was 14 and we started our first band, I tell this story it was after seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. And everybody, all the girls were on the phone, 2 sisters, one of my sisters, and another girl that lived down the road. We were talking after the Beatles on the phone, and we decided to form a band, and everybody chose an instrument, and I didn't speak up quick enough. So it was said to me, "You're going to play bass." And I said, "Okay." And lucky for me, when I put it on, my dad gave me, for my first bass, it's amazing. I make musicians green. I had a 1957 Fender Precision given to me to learn on. It was written in the stars I was going to be a serious bass player,
Do they make smaller basses? Because that thing looks like it's as tall as you are.
I know, and when people say that, I just want to punch them. It just doesn't occur to me. I said to my dad, "Do you have a bass?" "Yes, I do." "Can I have it?" "Yes, you can." He gave it to me. I didn't know there were smaller basses. So really, because I didn't know it, I just learned on that. And when I play a smaller one now, it feels like a toy. But no, I didn't know, and I don't care. I like the big bass. I like the long neck. I like the heavy body. It just suits me perfect. Most people that know me say it looks like I was born playing a bass guitar.
You said that you could read and write music. Did your dad teach you, or did you actually have formal training?
I had formal training in percussion and piano. Self-taught on bass. And I play guitar as well. So properly trained percussion, piano, and then self-taught bass. And I play enough guitar to write songs. And I'm not a good guitar player, though, because I was one of these unusual bass players that didn't fail on guitar and then go to bass, you know. And a lot of them did, but not me. I just went to the bass. When I was young, I used to get a big, long broom and put rubber bands around it and pretend to pluck a standard bass, believe it or not. So that was always in my wavelength. And also, what I always remember is all the family trips we took, which were numerous because, 5 kids, you're not going to go on a plane. It's going to be too expensive. A lot of them were car trips, and we always had sing-songs. And my dad would always be going, doom, ba-doom, 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 doom, doom. And I used to think, damn, he's got the best part. So I always had this in my head. I'm a natural bass player. It's just natural instrument for me.
How did you get approached to be a subject of a documentary all about you?
Well, there was an aborted documentary about 18 years ago by a good friend of mine. She was actually a bass player for a very short time in the Runaways, Vicky Blue. We became good friends, and we started to do one. And then some of the people, actually one of the people that I don't want to give any names of, but one of the people that was in it being interviewed decided that she didn't like how she looked on camera and refused permission, taking the guts out of the documentary. So, yeah, it wasn't very nice. So that one kind of got aborted. We're still good friends, so Vicky, and it wasn't my fault. And then this guy, Liam Firmager, he contacted me about 4.5 years ago now, and he said he would like to do a documentary on me. So I said, I didn't know who he was. I said, tell me about yourself. He said to me, I got to tell you right away, though, I'm not a fan. And I kind of went, oh, that was surprising. And he said, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. He said, I like your music. It's just I'm not a fan. So I went, oh, okay, fair enough. It's okay. And then I said, well, if you're not a fan, then why do you want to do this documentary? And he said, because when I saw you talking on a television show, I found you fascinating. So I knew I had found my guy. He would be objective. He would be honest. He would be strong about what he thought. And even if we clashed a bit, I was going to get the honest, no holds barred, raw documentary that I wanted, the truth. I wanted that, and I knew he would give that to me. It took about 4 years to make the documentary. He went everywhere,
Well, yeah, how is that working with him and then also seeing your life? I mean, gosh, you've been in this business for so long and then seeing it all just kind of taken down to like 90 minutes or so.
It doesn't seem like 90 minutes. It seems like it lasts for 6 days when you watch it because it's your life up there. So you're like going, oh my God, it's a strange reaction. You almost want to run away. It's just strange to see your life up on the screen. Some of the things people said, they just humbled me. I was crying half the time when I was watching it. And, some of the things made me hurt. Some of them made me laugh. Some of them made me smile. It was warts and all. And it affects me every time I watch it. If you were to see your life on the screen, you'd be the same. You just kind of go, oh my God. Oh my God. I did all that. Oh my God. And somebody says something nice. You go, oh my God. You're forever going, oh my God.
Full disclosure, I am a child of the 70s, so my first exposure to you was on Happy Days. So I knew that you had acted in that. And then I'm a fan of Midsummer, and I see you on that, and I'm just like, oh my God, I didn't realize that she had worked more. And then I looked up your filmography, and I'm just like, wow, you've done so much acting, and then to find out that you've written books and just your radio show, just so many things. And it's like they just get barely touched on in the doc. It just adds to your full character of just how inventive you are.
I'm an artiste. I have to put it that way. I didn't get in the business for a minute. I got in it for a lifetime. Entertaining is my big thing, and rock and roll obviously is in my heart and in my soul. But I always knew that I would not be boxed in, and I would do whatever this big ball of wax that is called being an artist it will allow me to do, And And I hope I have the sense not to try to do something I can't. But all the things I've done, they've all been about communicating, creating, and entertaining. You know, so it's all the same ball of wax. I use the same instinct when I'm acting a role as I do when I go on the stage and play a song, or when I'm writing a poem or writing a song. It's all the same thing, really. For me, it's just called being an artist.
Was Happy Days, was that your first acting gig?
Yes, can you believe it? I said to Ron Howard, because I was curious, you know, I remained friends with all these people. I asked him one time on the phone, because I was curious to his answer. I said, did it ever seem to you like I was a brand new actress on the show? And he said, absolutely not. You felt like an old pro and that you'd been there from the start of the series. And I went, that's exactly what I felt like. That's strange. It's strange how that happened. I guess I just slotted in, didn't I?
Well, it just made sense. I mean, as soon as they introduced Leather Tuscadero, it's like, oh yeah, well, obviously it's...
I know, crazy. Part of the show. And it was so natural, wasn't it? Yeah.
Where did the hip slap finger gun thing come from?
In a lot of these shows, they try to come up with what they call in the business a bit of business. So it's a finger snap, or it's a salute, or it's something, you know, like Ron Howard used to go, I found my thrill, you know. So everybody has a bit of business, and somebody suggested that, and I tried a few things, and then I went, dum, dum, and that one felt right to me.
And I can't believe that they were offering you your own show, your own spinoff.
Yes, but I had done enough. I had done 3 seasons as Leather Tuscadero, and I didn't want to be typecast. Again, I won't be boxed in. So that's enough. That's enough of that character. And I was right, because I went on to do, as you saw in the doc, so many other things, you know.
Are you still doing radio shows?
I left about a year ago. I did 15 years on BBC Radio 2, which is the biggest station in Europe. I was one of the most popular DJs, but I left because I found out that they were reluctant to play my new albums because I was a DJ on their station, and that made me angry. And I said, I'm an artist first, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to go. That's not to say I won't go back and do some more things. I probably will, but now they're playing my records, you know, so I didn't like that. Yeah, I didn't like it. But I do like doing radio.
What do you think it is about Australia that makes you so popular there?
I don't know. People have always asked me that. Japan and Australia were always my 2 biggest markets. I mean, you know, I've had number ones in every country, but Australia is particularly good. I don't know what it is, and I get asked that by Australian people too. There's something about us, me and them, that we just connected from day one. They've taken me in as one of their own. They understand me. We've grown up together. We've kind of have had a love affair since day one. I always say we are lovers and we should never get married.
What do you feel your relationship is with England? Because you've been over there, what, more than half your life?
I don't know how it happened. You know, I didn't plan this. I had 2 offers in the same week, one from Elektra Records, and they saw the band, Cradle, and they didn't like the band at all, and they offered me a solo contract. Mickey Most came in the same week to record at Motown. He saw the band, he didn't like the band, and he only wanted me. So Elektra wanted me to go to New York and get a guy band around me and become the next Janis Joplin. Mickey Most said, come to England, I'll put a boy band around you, and I will make you into the first Suzi Quatro. So that's kind of like a no-brainer, right? And I came here, and it just took about 18 months before I had success. So in all that 18 months, I'm putting down roots, you know. And then I fell in love with my guitar player, so putting down roots again. And I ended up just staying. It wasn't planned. And now my kids are English and, you know, whatever. But I'm always, as you can hear, I don't lose my accent. I am an American in England. I always will be. But I do like it here. I do like it. I love it where I live and travel all the time. I come back a lot to America. I always toured there. Been back there a few times lately. I did several radio shows from there, documentaries. I had my 60th in Detroit, my 65th in Detroit. I got the Michigan Rock and Roll Hall of Fame award. I got the She-Vox of Fame in January in L.A., and then I went in Texas and got the Woman of Valor Award. So I've been back and forth quite a bit, you know. It's not like I don't come home.
I was so glad to see Alice Cooper in the documentary. I can't imagine what it was like touring with him when you were both so young.
Well, it was welcome to my nightmare. We did 85 shows. But I mean it nicely. We've known each other a very long time. He always calls me his little sister.
Did I read right that you are now learning German?
I'm married to a German man, for 27 years now, and we actually live in separate countries. He lives in Hamburg and I live in England, and we go back and forth, which is great, except when there's a pandemic. And then it's not so great. So we were 2.5 months apart. That's not good. But now I'm going there again at the end of this month, because I went there for my 70th birthday, and then I had to come back to the UK and quarantine for 2 weeks, and now I'm going back again. So, and I don't speak German, though. I mean, he's never spoken German with me. He always speaks English.
Are you still touring?
Nonstop. I did 85 shows last year. I had one of the busiest years since the 70s. Was certainly high as a kite. My album No Control came out, which is, I think, one of my finest albums. Got absolute rave reviews around the world. I've never had such reviews. They were dissecting the songs and quoting lyrics back to me. And I did it, wrote and produced it with my son, which was unexpected. We didn't know it was going to happen. We just thought we were having some fun. And all of a sudden it was serious. My documentary came out again to rave reviews, and I mean rave. It's gone all over the world very successfully. I'm working on the movie of my life now. Of course, I'm not gigging right now, but I think if it goes ahead, the gigs are going to start again in September. So I work all the time. I am a working artist. That's what I am. And we're now writing songs for the next album together, and we've done 14 already.
Do you ever regret that leather became your trademark? I mean, doesn't that get hot on stage?
I do make the joke sometimes. I say, right, how dumb am I? I chose the heaviest instrument. I play bass guitar and the hottest outfit. How dumb am I? No, I don't know. I just, it's funny. It's funny to me that happened. I'm so used to wearing it now, and it actually keeps me fit, to tell you the truth. How many 70-year-olds do you know that can jog 5 miles? How many 70-year-olds or 69, the last gig I did, do you know that can do 2-hour show on stage with the leather jumpsuit and the bass guitar and be jogging around and singing and playing and do everything I do, and I'm not a quiet performer, and not even be out of breath at the end of the show.
Sounds like rock and roll is keeping you young.
It is. That's what it is. My husband gets quite annoyed. Why aren't you out of breath? Sorry, but I'm not.
Going back to the question of boiling down your life to a documentary, I mean, were there things that you wanted in there or things that you wanted to express that you weren't able to in the time that was allotted?
No. In fact, it was quite a nice long documentary. I think we covered everything sufficiently. I said everything I wanted to say. The record was put straight. You saw me warts and all, which is what I wanted. I am pleased. I'm so pleased with how he did it. I think he created a work of art. He did a bloody good job.
Ms. Quatro, thank you so much. This was such an honor to talk with you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. I hope you got everything you needed.
How did you guys meet?
We met, it was quite a long time ago we first met through a mutual friend who was doing a film. I think Liam was shooting it, and it was a sort of a mockumentary feature that ended up with 30 or 40 sort of people contributing. Yeah, and that was it. And we just, remembered each other. And then Liam had another project going, which he was talking to me about a few years ago. And that was struggling a little bit. And then out of the blue, I got this call from him and said, "Hey, I've just met Suzi Quatro and she's agreed to do a film."
Liam, how did you come up with the idea of doing a Suzi Quatro documentary?
At the time, I was definitely on the hunt for a music-based documentary, because being a musician like Tate, I just had a real affinity for the subject and a real curiosity about the lives of rock stars, and I was really just looking for a suitable subject, really, in my periphery. And a mutual friend had suggested that no one had done a documentary on Suzi Quatro, and my immediate reaction was, well, I'm not really a diehard fan. I'm not sure how I would do that. And then I actually sat on it for a couple of days, and I thought, oh, hang on a minute, I could actually bring a real interesting perspective, objectivity to this. And so I sort of reevaluated my feelings about Suzi and listened to more of her music. And I thought, no, this is really good. She's got an interesting story. And I knew that the magnitude of the project, or what I perceived it to be, was too big for me alone. And I knew Tate was a real gun at this sort of stuff. So that's when I reached out and said, hey, look what I got.
Tate, how did you end up becoming a producer?
I played in bands when I was really young, started quite young, sort of from 15 to 26, I suppose. And somewhere in my mid-20s, I started working in the film industry, but actually in cinemas and in distribution. So I've really professionally worked in film the whole time. But I did all these other things, distribution, running cinemas, distributing films, and it sort of led to producing. But all the time, of course, when you're into music, you're into music. It's like a lifetime. It's a lifetime sentence. So I haven't played for a long time, but other than in my garage. But I'm old enough to have been around the first time when Suzi broke. And as you can probably tell from the film, Suzi was huge in Australia right from the get-go. So I was very aware of her. I loved the music when I was a kid. And I was very aware of her career. And because she still tours here regularly, there's some guy here who's kept a log. He's got a website of every international tour, of every international artist in Australia since, post-World War II. And he claims that Suzi Quatro has toured more than anybody.
Even ABBA.
Even ABBA, yeah.
Wow.
So Suzi would be here, and like everyone, her career over a long time, 40 years now. We've seen these wanes, even within Australia. She would be doing, not great venue back in the 90s or something, doing maybe not the best venues and only playing to a few hundred people. And last year she was playing several thousand people again in all the major cities. There's certainly a baby boomer nostalgia kind of wave, but we went to shows. What we really loved we went to shows, and there were people of all ages. Obviously, parents who were bringing their kids, and a lot of 20-somethings. It's just Australians have always related to her as a real kind of guitar-based hard rock. That's the way we see her here. So much of in the film we flirt with these things about the way she's perceived in different places, and here she's seen as a hard rock act.
Liam, this wasn't your first documentary. Can you tell me a little bit about King of the Mountain?
It was completed, but unfortunately due to all sorts of issues, including licensing costs, that were shelved. I just feel a very natural affinity with the documentary form. I've dabbled with drama and comedy and things like that, and my background is music video predominantly, but there just seems to be some kind of simpatico with me in documentaries. I really enjoy them. I enjoy the process, and I enjoy, peeling the layers on subjects and getting to the heart of the story, and more so than perhaps other preceding people have done. Because I never wanted to do a straight music documentary that most people do sort of churn out. Most of them are sort of based on tragedy or sort of a posthumous theme. And I thought it was a real challenge to do one on somebody who was very much alive and kicking. And almost catching a second wave of their career, right near the end, so to speak. So, and I thought, that's a real challenge. That's really interesting. So
once you decided that you were going to make this, you said that you met with Suzi, and I'm curious what her reaction to that proposal was.
Oh, I think Suzi is very much a 50-year veteran of the industry. So she's very protective or defensive of her legacy, if you like. And so I think it was a lot of toing and froing between her to sort of build a certain amount of trust that she was putting this in the right hands of myself and Tate. I knew it would be a challenge. I knew it would take a while to sort of peel those layers and get behind the mask, so to speak. But I was confident that we could do it because, reading her autobiography, I could tell that she wasn't obviously a shrinking violet, and she wasn't going to put a heavy spin on the truth. So it was really just a matter of building that actual trust foundation, to know we had a film and to make it work.
One of the other things about the film taking so long to complete was actually, in some respects, it was a drag for us, but it gave us this ongoing access to Suzi. I mean, we interviewed her many times over maybe 4 years. Oh, right up towards the end. Remember, we did another interview. So she had more access to us as well. She got to know us better. She understood the film. By the end, she really understood the film. She'd already seen an early cut, and we could keep digging and digging a bit further. And if there was anything that we were missing in the narrative, we came back probably 7 interviews. I think we probably did with her over in different countries over 4 years. We had to get past as Liam was sort of alluding to before, she she's told the story so many times. Can you imagine? You know? So we had to get past the pre-rehearsed narrative, the version that she just naturally comes out with, and push her a bit. So that was like an indirect, benefit of taking so long to complete the film.
Exactly.
We always wanted to get to the subject. We knew that's the kind of person she is. She's very driven, and we knew that she'd done all these different things, like even moving into musical theatre and writing and publishing poetry. And not a lot of rock stars, do that. So
that was a really nice device, the idea of her poetry throughout and just kind of framing up different moments of her life with that. That was very clever.
Creatively speaking, what she does is maybe unconsciously very off the moment, very biographical. So if you look at the Suzi's songs and what she was recording through her career, they were almost chapter marks of where she was at that time or what she was experiencing. And that's true of the poetry as well. So it was a real blessing to be able to utilize not only the songs, but those poetry pieces as chapters almost, as indicators.
How did you finally manage to break through that facade? I'm very curious. Was it just a matter of the time, or were there certain things where you were able to finally connect with her and where you would actually be like, oh, I'm seeing something that I haven't seen before?
Well, we were recording at her house in England, and Tate joined us for that journey, that particular trip. On the first day of filming, we felt like we weren't getting anywhere. We had the crew there, we had the lights there. And so Tate actually suggested at the end of that day that maybe I would come back the next day just by myself and leave the crew at home, and I would just do the sound and the lights by myself. And that was really the breakthrough moment, because then it became much more of a conversational piece between two friends, if you like. We were just in this room alone together for hours. And that's when she really opened up, because she wasn't performing for the camera anymore or, for the people in the room. She was just having a very honest, sincere conversation. And I think at that moment it was a good, masterstroke by Tate to suggest that. But I knew at that moment we definitely had a film, more than a film, something that was really interesting.
With those subsequent interviews, did you leave everybody at home, or was she more comfortable now if, say, Tate came with you?
I think it triggered a point of trust at that point. So it really it didn't matter who was there after that. It became just a very open dialogue, if you like. That was my most enjoyable part of the experience, was those moments.
Liam said that he's not a fan, but Tate, are you a fan of Suzi Quatro, or were you a fan of her work before you started this project?
I was definitely aware of all the original albums through the 70s. Am I a monster fan? No. I mean, we've met the mega fans. I'm not a mega fan. But, of course, working on it for so long and revisiting all the material as we did, I have come to really love most of the albums. Some are certainly better than others, and there are a couple later albums, even into the, I guess it's the 90s. She starts to go a bit soft. But those first few records, they're also incredibly well produced. I mean, Mike Chapman's an absolute genius, and I realized later that no one covers those songs because they're really hard to reproduce. There's a few producing tricks that Lenny and Suzi talk about and Mike talks about, where he speeds up. I think it's in the film, they sped it up a tiny bit, that he would double track guitars and just lift the drums right up in the mix, like the drums are the dominant instrument, and then he double tracks Suzi's vocals and things like this. They were, pretty ahead of their time for 1973, 1974. And I just always knew there was something special about those records. But my favorite song of all, honestly, is actually a ballad that Mike Chapman wrote called The Girl from Detroit City, which is like a cruisy Motown kind of, R&B groove that we just love. And when was that, Liam? Like quite recent, right?
Yeah, I think it was in the last, 5 years ago. She did that with Mike as an add-on for the box set release of hers, the compilation.
Yeah.
And it was just, it's a wonderful track and a killer bass line. And surprisingly, Mike wrote the lyrics to it. You would imagine that it was Suzi writing those lyrics. They're so personal and so autobiographical, but it was actually Mike who penned it. And obviously he knows her because he absolutely nailed it.
What were some of the biggest challenges, Liam, that you had making this documentary?
I think the biggest challenge, and I think it's true of, any filmmaker wherever you are, and that is financing, especially when you're dealing with a subject matter that requires so much licensing and permissions and the songs alone. If you don't know who to talk to, if you don't know which treks to Greece, you're just paying through the nose for this stuff, and it's very prohibitive if you don't get the support and the investment required. A lot of similar documentaries stall exactly because of that reason, and that's certainly my experience.
What had to have been tough too, because you point out in the documentary that she was switching labels quite often.
Gets so messy over time where even an individual song might be licensed to like 3 or 4 different parties now, because people have done other deals. Like Nicky Chin's publishing is handled by somebody else for North America and stuff like that. But it's true that in a way that was the hardest thing because we got fantastic access. Everyone that we approached, with one exception, was happy to talk to us and made it work and fit into the schedule because they all these people who knew Suzi's, role and knew the history and knew her significance, they were happy to, to testify to that. And that was that. I thought that would be the hard bit. But no, Alice and, Henry Winkler and Cherie Curry, Joan, that was actually easy. Organizing our schedules, that was another matter. We chased Joan Jett and her schedule for 2 or 3 years. And then the irony was, we ended up interviewing her on tour in Melbourne, 5 minutes from my office. We would have gone to the side of the world to get the interview. And Alice too. Remember Alice at the venue, which is also 5 minutes from the office, So we had some good fortune there, again, through the benefit of having time where we eventually waited and they came to us.
Their enthusiasm and willingness to sort of participate is simply because they all did recognize that Suzi had been sort of unfairly marginalized and her legacy kind of pushed aside. And so I think that's why, they all put their hand up and just said, yeah, when do you want us? It surprised Tate and myself immensely because we did think that was going to be a real challenge, but it wasn't. That was the easy part.
Well, I'm sure that the licensing couldn't have been a surprise to you as far as how difficult that was. Was there anything that kind of shocked you as far as we thought this was going to be the simple thing and then it ends up being the hard thing?
Certainly one thing was wanting to find archive material that wasn't, that everyone had not seen. That was a lazy, cheap 1-hour television version would have had a third of the number of interviews and a third of the number of songs and wouldn't have done the archive research that we did. Although I realized in the YouTube era or the Google era, people are used to seeing all this material, but they see a low-res version on their computer and it kind of looks okay, but they don't understand that the film, you've really got to try and get the originals or best quality scans and things like that. And same with music video clips from, say, TV appearances or whatever. We're talking about material from the 70s and 80s, and a lot of that had disappeared and was lost. The BBC famously reused their videotapes, that like anyone going into that era just, I know whole feature films that, TV movies that were erased by the BBC. But the personal stuff and the important stuff, the subject matter was, not the headache that we kind of expected, I suppose. The other thing was that at some point in the middle of the process, we started pitching the film when we're talking to Americans. The issue of Suzi's confused identity really came up. I had people tell me as we're looking at a photo of Suzi, I had Americans telling me, no, that's Joan Jett. And I've been researching it for 3 years and they're trying to tell me that it's just, really. So that thing that Joan said, which we did not prompt, where Joan makes a comment about people used to come up to me and go, hey, thinking I was in Happy Days. We didn't prompt that. She volunteered that, but that's exactly what we experienced. So then we realized, and I'm not just saying this because we're talking to you now. I think 2/3 of the way through the editing of the film, we sort of changed the direction a little bit. We felt like we were making a film for North America, because we had history that needed to be rewritten or corrected. That became really important to me. And the fact that she's from Detroit, not from Essex or Manchester, but from Detroit just makes it even more bizarre and poignant. Detroit is so important to Suzi. You think it might have a fashion, believe me, wherever we are, whenever she's talking about how her heart is in Detroit.
How was her family to deal with?
Her family are actually really lovely people. Her sisters are lovely people to a fault. I mean, I really enjoyed their company and they were very willing to sit down and talk. It's interesting, obviously, the way they come across in the documentary because, Italian-American families are very vocal. It's a strange dynamic that's, to the outsider may seem a little abrasive or unsympathetic, but that's just really the dynamic of the family. And I guess we all have different dynamics in each family, so to outsiders, we all probably look a bit odd or whatever. In that context, I understand, or I got some insight into that dynamic, and they're just a very honest, vocal Italian-American family who talk with their hands, and I know that they've probably been a little taken aback, I guess, by the reaction of the film, and I know that there's a little, the tension with Suzi and her sister still to this day does exist, and I'm not sure if that will ever be resolved. I have no idea there, but they're just a very honest family, even when the camera's rolling.
It was that frankness that we really appreciated. I mean, it's Nancy, the younger sister, who says, and people often misinterpret what she says. She says, I will never be a fan of Suzi Quatro. And then she qualifies that by saying, I love everything she's done, but what she's genuinely saying is I'm not a fan. How can I be? I'm a sister. We have a deeper and different dynamic. She's not being nasty. She's just being really honest. It was a surprise to us, though, that women that age would still have this lingering sort of resentment almost that their sister had this success that, maybe they had really wanted it as well. It never crossed our mind that this would still be a thing, but it clearly is. But now on reflection, we totally get it.
I think a few people have mentioned after seeing the film, they were like, wow, I found that stuff with her sisters really kind of sad and fascinating, and geez, I wish you kind of delved into that a bit more. And I kind of thought, well, I don't think me or Tate wanted to exploit that either. We obviously want to talk about it and touch upon it and examine it, but I think we wanted to pull back a little and not exploit that or be too voyeuristic about it, because there was a lot of trust involved in sitting down with them and talking about this. And ultimately, this is Suzi's story. Yeah, that was on our mind first and foremost. How do we handle that specific topic in the film?
What's got to be so difficult for you guys to take a woman who's had this long career, this great life, and try to condense that down into 90 minutes for a feature documentary? I mean, there are so many different routes that you can go when it comes to your research, and so many different things that you can choose to show or not. What was your original cut of this movie like, and what are some of the things, I always talk about how you kill your babies. What were some of those babies that you had to kill along the way?
Well, the future director's cut will be 6 hours long, so it was very difficult, as we call it, drowning those puppies. Because in all honesty, it could well have been 2 hours long quite easily.
Yeah, we had a 3-hour cut when it was more than, a bit more than a sort of a rough cut. It was a bit more than an assembly, and that was 3 hours. And then we just, honed away at that. But yeah, what do we have to lose? I suppose there was a version in which we plotted in a more linear way through, the 80s and 90s and into the noughties. And that we had to really kind of compress all that. We spent so much time on the early period because we felt, going back to what I was saying about realizing we had to maybe redress some history, particularly for North America. We wanted to plant the seeds of that, the origin of with the Pleasure Seekers in the 60s and Suzi's rise in the early 70s to cement this sense of, she was first. And I would have people telling me, oh yeah, but what about Heart and what about the Runaways? And I'm going, guys, it's just history. It's just fact, Do you want me to pull out all the dates? So on the other hand, we wanted to back that up, which is why we have that passage in the film where we do reference the handful of other women going right back to Big Mama Thornton, who played guitar. For us, the defining element was not being a singer, being a player in a rock band, not pop. Even Grace Slick, we're like a hippie folk, Jefferson Airplane, like a hippie folk band with electric guitars. And I love Grace Slick, but there's really only Janice, as far as I'm concerned, that comes before. And we just wanted to get their history right. But when you see Big Mama Thornton wearing her best Sunday dress, looks like she's just gone to church, and she's playing that beautiful white Gibson SG, and she's playing like the filthiest, dirtiest blues. You gotta have some respect for that. I mean, she's just extraordinary.
Well, tell me a little bit of the history of the film, because I know that it's shown in Australia, and I'm curious where else it's shown and what the reaction has been so far.
We premiered it in Melbourne at the Melbourne International Film Festival, I think back in August, wasn't it, Tate?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reaction from the get-go was phenomenal to me anyways. I was just taken aback by the positivity and the reaction from people. And then we took it to the UK, and we had a cinema run there in the UK with a number of screenings, and then it went to Germany, Italy. Am I right here?
Yeah. Well, then it was festivals, so I forget what order, but you went to that one in Hof, and then there's a music-focused series of festivals that take place in various places called In Edit. So that was Barcelona, and I think it also might have played in Madrid. And then we've done sales to Japan, and the film just opened in Germany. The cinemas are open there, but only half open. So obviously, like everyone, in the last sort of 4 months, everything was disrupted, including the American release. I mean, our American distributor had already way back in March had 25 cities booked, for a cinema release. Suzi was going to come. I think there was a festival. American premiere was going to be at Sonoma in California. That was about March. Suzi was all booked to come. And just everything, of course, has been cancelled. It's already played in Holland on television and sold to a number of European countries. But North America, in some ways, is the important one. Weirdly, is the important one. I think it'll have more resonance there. We're just really curious to see how people receive it.
It's kind of like her career, it looks like. You show number one over here, all these different places, and then it comes to America, and it's like, didn't even chart. So hopefully you'll finally be able to crack the charts with this documentary.
Yes. I think what's pleasing is with the initial response from reviews and critics thus far with North America is I was very apprehensive as to how they would handle it, how they would receive it, whether they would understand it or care even. But that particular reaction has been phenomenal, The reviewers actually understand what the film's about. They understand the intent. They actually understand that Suzi's legacy has been marginalized and criminally forgotten, and that it's time to celebrate her again. And, that gives me real hope, that maybe we have sort of got it right.
Liam, Tate, thank you so much for your time. This was a real pleasure talking with you guys.
No,
absolute pleasure. Thank you.
This is WJR-FM, the studios in the Tower of Pacific.
I remember those summer nights, riding in cars, getting in fights, bar after bar, night after night. Oh, those Detroit city lights. And all those long hot summer days, lying around in a purple haze, dreaming about being a star, driving a big car. Money to earn, money to burn, standing in the shadows, waiting for my turn.
All right, we are back and talking about Suzi Q. So I did have the question, and I think I've already got my answer as far as do you need to be a Suzi fan to enjoy this movie? I don't think any of us were Suzi fans necessarily. Talking about fans earlier, but I don't think we were hardcore fans of Suzi before watching this film.
I even like to think that you could sort of say, I've never heard her music, or, I don't particularly care for the music, but still find this film fascinating. And that's really what a good documentary, never mind a music documentary, should be able to do. You come in not caring for the subject matter. I mean, I know a lot of people who say that they don't particularly like watching sport, but some of the greatest documentaries that they've seen are sporting related films. And I think the same should hold true with a really good music documentary. And really, I think that Liam and Tate got this right. They edited it right. And just Suzi Quatro is a fascinating musician. She's a fascinating person. And there's something there about, well, this is her music career, but there's the human side of it. You know, this is the scenario that she faced with her sisters, and really don't need to be any sort of music fan to sort of be able to relate to that. It's just the story of someone who believed that she should have made it bigger than she did. There's a quote early on or maybe it's late in the film where she says, it's important to be validated by the ones that you love the most. That's universal. And that is, to a large extent, the theme of the film. So, yeah, I definitely think that you don't need to be a Suzi Quatro fan. You don't even need to know who she is. And sad to say, it seems like a lot of Americans still don't. I think anyone who just likes a well-told story should be able to get into this.
I agree. And I will say I am not a Suzi Quatro expert, but I am definitely a fan, enough of a fan that I do own a T-shirt. That is true. I do have a Suzi Quatro T-shirt, but also even in New York City, I can guarantee you plenty of people see that, and it's definitely an obscure thing to wear. They don't go, oh, wow, cool Suzi Quatro shirt, or at least most people don't. But I agree with you. I think this documentary does one of the best things a music documentary can do, which is introduce people to something who may know nothing about it. And you're right that unfortunately, she was never, huge in the States. And I hope that this film helps. I hope in particular that young girls and young women see this, because she deserves much more attention than she's gotten here. And I think as an introduction, this movie's a really, really great start for anybody who's interested.
As soon as you said, Morris, this film is an introduction to somebody and that you might not know who she is, and that the best documentaries are the way that, you might not know the subject matter. I immediately thought of Joe Bryant AD, this documentary about Joe Bryant, the quote unquote, the American Bowie. I had no idea who Joe Bryant was. Just a friend of mine, Dion from Toronto, who's been on the show before. He recommended this documentary to me, and he started to tell me a little bit, but I was like, no, don't tell me too much. And I was exposed to this whole thing. I had no idea who this person was, and it just is an absolutely fascinating story. I would say the same thing for the Klaus Nomi documentary. Like, I know a little Klaus Nomi as far as, Lightning Strikes, his cover of that, and seeing him in something like Erga Music War. That's it. And so to know the entire, or what they fit into the documentary, the Klaus Nomi story, was like, wow. So I agree. Like, checking out documentaries about people who you may not know. I mean, it's weird because if you think about any quote unquote regular documentary, think about something like, the Three Complete Strangers. It's like, okay, I don't know what this story is. I'm going to walk in, I'm going to see this and be fascinated by it. I don't know why we would necessarily only want to see music documentaries about people that we already know, especially because if you're like me, you just sit and bitch about the things that they missed. Whereas with this, I don't know what they missed out of Suzi's life because, like you said, I'm not a fan. So there could be whole chapters where it's like, wow, I really wish they would have covered when she did X, Y, and Z, but I'm too stupid to know that they're not doing that. So I get to sit in a blissful little bubble and enjoy what I see with Suzi Q because I was riveted the entire time.
On the very first episode of See Here, it was Tim's choice, and he hated the Gigi Allen story. Now, I didn't even know who Gigi Allen was at the time. And I watched this documentary and, musically, that was not my thing at all. But the film was absolutely fascinating. Once again, a great story is a great story told. And yeah, like you say, Mike, I can't imagine why anyone would just sort of want to say, right, I'm going to stick with my bubble and I know this band, so I want to watch a documentary. I mean, there's nothing wrong with watching documentaries about musicians who you love. Of course, they're often who the things are aimed at. But I know that a few years ago, my son Max went and said to me, hey, you should watch this documentary Metal Evolution by the Canadian documentarian Sam Dunn. And it was like a whole 10-part TV series. And okay, so the first few episodes were going to be up my alley. With the origins of proto-metal and the early 70s metal, but certainly as it goes through the 80s and into the 90s and beyond, Musically is definitely not my thing, but I found every second of that TV series so interesting. And it's not just about not knowing an artist. It can be a documentary about something that you don't even necessarily care about. But once again, a great story is a great story.
I want to thank my co-host, Morris and Leon. Leon, what have you been up to during lockdown, sir?
I just finished editing a feature documentary called The Big Johnson, which is directed by a really fun woman who's originally from here in New York named Lola Rock'n'Rolla. That's currently in post-production, but look for it hopefully in the near future. Also been doing some pro bono editing for political organizations right now, just to stay in shape and keep my sanity. And I'm very slowly working on my next, my own documentary. If you want to know more about who I am or what I've been up to lately, the best thing you can do is check out leonchase.com.
You even made a little bit of a splash there. You got picked up by a couple online places for the new edit of Blade Runner you did.
You want to talk about crazy ideas that I never would have done if I had absolutely nothing to do with my time, that then accidentally became in terms of numbers, it's probably one of the most successful things I've ever made, which is weird. I've also learned that there are people out there who really, really, really don't like if you play around with their favorite movies.
Well, I saw it and I loved it. And I think having Navin Johnson as one of the replicants was a really good idea. And Morris, how are your projects going?
That's the beautiful thing about podcasting. As long as you have Skype, nothing changes during this COVID period. So, look, this month we got, for Love That Album, I'll be speaking to a fellow who was the first manager of Fairport Convention. One of my listeners had said, "Oh, look, I'm a friend of this fellow. Would you like to speak to him?" I thought, "Oh, well, hell, I'm a Fairport Convention fan and a huge Richard Thompson fan, so put me in touch with him, and we'll be recording that next week." And he's done a lot of other things that are Fairport related beyond his time managing them. So be interesting to get his perspective on what the folk music scene of England was like in the mid 60s in parallel to the rock and roll scene of the time. For See Here, it was Bernie's pick this month, and he's picked a film I'd never even heard of. But always a big fan of watching 70s American cinema. So he found a film with Peter Fonda and Susan St. James called Outlaw Blues. Never even heard of it before this. So looking forward to giving that a watch and seeing where that goes. I watched the trailer, and it sort of looks like maybe a country and western version of the Blues Brothers. These two characters are being chased everywhere by the cops and by everyone who pisses them off. But we'll watch the film and see whether that turns out to be the case.
I just have to ask, is there a point where they have to play a soul bar?
After I've watched it, I'll let you know. I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Please head on over to the website, projectionboothpodcast.com, where you can find out more about today's show. You also find a link over to Patreon, where you can make a donation to the show. Every donation we get helps the Projection Booth take over the world.
And your boyfriend's name is Eagle, and he disappeared. Welcome to the dive.
She go down. If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.